Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So, just a heads up, this seems like it could be a controversial topic. I wish it wasn't a controversial topic, but let's be kind to each other in the comments. This is just my opinion, my humble opinion. So, it's not necessarily correct, but I think I have good evidence behind my opinion. So, yeah, let's get into it. Now, before we get started, I just want to shout out our newest two patrons, Ira and Sean. Thanks so much for supporting us, guys. It means a lot to us. So, the topic of today's video is, as you probably saw from the thumbnail, why streetcars are better than buses. Now, to be perfectly clear, that doesn't mean that streetcars are, always better than buses. I don't think that is necessary for the statement I'm making to be true. Rather, I think that streetcars can offer higher capacity, better quality service, and honestly, also just a more sustainable system than buses can, and I'm going to tell you why in this video. Now, I also want to make something clear. When I talk about streetcars, I'm not talking about the Oklahoma City streetcar or the Atlanta streetcar or the Portland streetcar. I don't think that these are really good examples of modern streetcar systems. The thing is, yes, in the United States, there's been a number of these new streetcar systems constructed in the recent years, but I think that these are largely a development tool, not a transportation tool. In terms of a modern streetcar network that I want to talk about, that would be Toronto, a city where streetcars have always basically existed as a transportation tool. And to be clear, functionally, there's a big difference between the Toronto streetcar network and the new streetcars we see implemented across the United States. However, from a cost basis, in terms of actually building these things, I don't think there's a huge difference. Any of the systems that were recently built in the United States could probably have been built just like Toronto's system, the differences of which I'll make clear in just a second. However, they were chosen not to for different reasons, and I'll try to explain that. Now, to be clear, other cities and different continents and countries call streetcars different things, trams, etc. I'm going to refer to everything as streetcars in this video, but do be clear that not every city refers to the vehicles as the same thing, even though they're essentially the same thing. I don't want to reference purely European systems because I think there's an easy argument for people to make in that, oh, we're not Europe, so we can't have European style systems. So I want to talk about Toronto a lot because Toronto is a North American streetcar system that's incredibly successful and that has, continued to evolve in the current day and age. So I think it's a really good example to bring up. So first thing I'm going to do is just go over all the common criticisms that I often hear about streetcars before we get into direct comparisons between buses and streetcars. So one of the first ones we often see is that streetcars often operate in mixed traffic, and that just can't work well. Now, diving deeper into that point about mixed traffic, plenty of the streetcar lines in Toronto that still carry massive numbers of people, at least compared to other surface transit routes across North America, do so in fully mixed traffic, interacting with cars. And the roads aren't, totally blocked to cars. Plenty of cars and bus traffic as well gets through on these streets like College Street and Dundas Street and Queen Street as well. So I think the idea that streetcars can exist in a mixed right-of-way is totally false. It works in Toronto and it works quite well. Now, of course, a lot of people are likely to bring up the point that streetcars can't move around accidents, which is an okay point in my personal opinion. However, I want to point something out. If you have a major accident on a street, enough to close down your streetcar line, it's probably a big enough accident that the street would be blocked off anyways to bus traffic, etc. as well. Now, if you have just a minor accident or a car stuck on the tracks, that sort of thing, well, in a minor accident, people are going to pull to the side of the street anyways. And I'm not talking really about putting streetcar lines on any, two-lane streets. I think 4 would probably be a minimum number of lanes you would have. In addition, if there's a car stuck on the street, that's a big deal even if you don't have streetcars. Like, you're massively limiting the capacity for throughput on that street. So you can get a tow truck there in a few minutes, no matter what. So I don't think that that's necessarily a great argument. Yes, buses can move around, but if you have a streetcar system, you just plan around having that streetcar system, and I think things can work plenty smoothly. Again, they do in Toronto. There's delays here and there, but generally on a day-to-day basis, the network runs fine, even in mixed traffic. Of course, to be clear, I'm not a fan of just putting all lines in mixed traffic. I don't necessarily think that's the argument that should be made. In fact, plenty of streetcar lines in Toronto and in other places as well are built in separate right-of-ways. Though, to be clear, that separate right-of-way can just be a painted lane, just like with some BRT systems. You don't necessarily need to do all the fancy stuff that's done for some LRT or pre-metro style systems. You just need dedicated lanes. Actually, if you look at the King Street project in Toronto, which still offers some limited through traffic for cars, the project carries a ton of people, and that's just by limiting how much cars can move on the street. So even in a limited mixed traffic environment, you can have a ton of streetcar throughput, as long as, again, you're not being car-centric. It's amazing to me that a lot of transit people and people who appreciate the importance of transit and want to expand transit often make their kind of plans around surface level transit like buses or streetcars based on cars and car users, when really we should be thinking about transit users, since especially in these dense urban corridors, it's not hard to have way more people using the transit than using the automobile lanes. In addition, it's also worth pointing out that a lot of major roads in the United States and Canada in dense urban cores still have on-street parking. So despite having all these massive parking garages underground under many major buildings, you still have on-street parking. You're still catering to a very small number of people who want to park their cars on major roadways, which should be for moving people, not for parking cars. Now, something else I want to point out is that, as we can see in examples across the United States and Canada in recent years, streetcars can be built quite inexpensively. Now, to be clear, streetcars and LRT are not equal. They're just definitely different things. LRT is kind of a hybrid between streetcars and like a pre-metro, and you can see that in cities like Seattle and Ottawa, which have possibly, you could argue, kind of light metro style service with LRT vehicles, which are similar to streetcar vehicles. Streetcars often have a lot less hard infrastructure, so you won't see these massive stations, you won't see a lot of operations off street, that sort of thing. And so there's a differentiating factor there. And I think by putting in a lot of these major stations and sometimes grade separations and tunneled sections, etc., that's what blows up the price of LRT. You also have the fact that you're building often long platforms because LRT has, stations instead of being served like a bus. If you look at a city like Toronto, or you look at other cities like Portland that have, new streetcar systems, you really only need a bus shelter. And now, I'm not saying that people don't, deserve more or whatever, but the practical thing, especially in Toronto, is that service is operated so frequently, as it should be, unlike many of the US streetcar systems, that you don't need this massive station for people to wait in. It's no different really than a bus. The streetcars are coming, every 5 minutes or so, and so you can always look down the street and see the next car, and hence, even in wintertime, it's just not that big of a deal, and people can wait a couple minutes and they'll be fine. So that's a way that costs are brought down a lot. And kind of the gauge I like to use is that you can look again at many of these cities, including Toronto, and you can see that the municipal governments alone have been able to fund streetcar extensions. And what that means is that streetcars are just a tier below something like LRT or metros, etc., in that, municipal local government can fund them, which is a big deal, because what it means is that you don't have to go to the states or provincial level governments to go get funding. The projects are smaller, there's less red tape, they can move more quickly, and they can be extended more frequently. So having the municipal governments being able to fund these projects is a big benefit. Now, I want to address those US streetcar systems again. To be clear, as I mentioned before, I don't think the intention of pretty much any of them is really moving people. If you look at the example, which is Portland, because Portland was the first pretty much of the new US streetcar systems to be built, the primary driving force behind building it was development. And along with many of the other streetcar systems that have been built in the United States, development has come. It's been very successful at driving new development because it's a great selling point to developers and to new prospective residents. The big issue I see is that, again, they're not planned for transportation. So a lot of the US streetcars are quite circuitous. They go in looping routes. They're a lot like the Detroit People Mover. They're just not great for getting around. Often, again, those loops are one directional. So it doesn't make sense to wait for a streetcar that often, again, doesn't have great service. These are often not run like bus services would be, where you have a bus less than every 10 minutes, but they're run every 15, every 20 minutes. So the service is really kind of a purely image thing. It's based on making the street look a certain way and attracting development rather than actually moving people. Again, as I mentioned too, a lot of these systems aren't actually operated by transit agencies, they're operated by city departments of transportation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the US streetcar systems that have been built in recent years, some of the ones I mentioned already, they're just not operated like local transit, which I think they need to be in order to be successful as local transit. And they should really be planned, in my personal opinion, more like bus lines, where you have a single linear corridor. You don't have this kind of looping pathway, because again, how often would you see a bus line that's basically just a random, circulator route through downtown? You might see it here and there, but it wouldn't be something that a local transit agency would do. It would be something for tourists, or something that is kind of done by the city as just a little shuttle bus. It's just not something that, again, a major transit agency would do, as well as seeing those low frequencies. One final point I want to mention is that there's now a number of streetcar vehicles available in North America in kind of a range of sizes. Because of all these new streetcar services that have popped up in the United States, there's been a new demand for streetcars. So actually there's a number of manufacturers who provide vehicles that can be operated on streetcar services, which is something that wasn't necessarily true a couple decades ago, including some of the higher capacity options in Toronto as well as other cities. Once you get to the higher capacity options, the streetcars basically are just single train LRVs, which is kind of an interesting thing to me. Now I'm going to get into the contentious part of this video, where I kind of say why I think streetcars are better than buses, at least in these high capacity scenarios. I'm gonna make it perfectly clear. I by no means think that we should just get rid of buses. I mean, is that really a thing that we could do? And replace all bus lines with streetcars? No, that doesn't make sense. Buses have a place. But much like buses have a place, I believe streetcars and tramways also have a place. And they serve different kind of areas, and they have different niches which they fill. And so I don't think that we need to get rid of all bus lines. I just simply think that there's places where we can replace a certain bus line with a streetcar line. As I mentioned before too, I think that the kind of way we think about streetcars in North America, it's very dogmatic. It's based on, we don't want to block traffic. We don't want to give up road space from private vehicles and dedicate it to rail or buses for that matter. Despite the fact that cities like Melbourne and Toronto do it, and both cities do it without having major congestion issues beyond what most other North American or Western cities would face. So now, why are streetcars better than buses? Well, first of all, streetcars have a much lower cost of operation. Now, once you have a streetcar line installed, you have a number of factors that reduce the cost of operation. First of all, streetcar tracks generally actually require less ongoing maintenance than roadways. Now, of course, roadways also are used by cars, but when you're thinking about it purely in terms of buses versus streetcars, well, streetcar right-of-ways can actually handle a lot of abuse, whereas regular roadways, they require repaving quite frequently. That's not to say that there isn't regular maintenance required for streetcar tracks, it's just that it's not that significant. However, the more significant factors in terms of lower cost of operations are things like fuel. Streetcars don't obviously consume diesel fuel, which the vast majority of buses still do. There are trolley buses and electric buses, but the majority of cities aren't operating those type of vehicles. The reality is that streetcars are just much cheaper to operate in terms of energy because electricity is very cheaply available, and electric traction is very efficient compared to fossil fueled powered traction. In addition, streetcar vehicles last much longer than buses. On average, buses last around 20 years for, a bus that's getting quite old, whereas streetcars can easily operate over 30 years. Now, that's not to say that I think, again, that streetcars should all be operating over 30 years, but if you look at our modern vehicles, they have a lot of the key amenities, things like accessibility and air conditioning, whereas I think that they won't necessarily need to be replaced as older vehicles were. And if you look again at Toronto, the previous streetcar fleet that we had in the city lasted around 40 years before it needed to be replaced, and largely the CLRVs did fine. They were relatively operational. There were a few issues, but they weren't things that couldn't have ever been fixed, so I think it's important to think about that. Now finally, perhaps the biggest thing that reduces the cost of operation is that you just need less of them. As is commonly cited in the TTC or Toronto Transit Commission's reporting and information, on average, replacing one streetcar takes about 3 buses. And so if you were to convert streetcar routes to bus routes, you'd have to operate buses super frequently, as many cities in North America do on those high traffic routes. The thing about this then is that you need to pay 3 drivers instead of just paying 1 driver. And of course that means you could potentially extend service hours with streetcars, because now you have some savings. You could deploy that to other service so that people are still driving vehicles. It's just that people are provided with more service. And that's not really surprising. Since they're on rails, streetcars can be wider and larger because, again, they're on rails, which means that they can take up more road space that's available, and that way they can have far more capacity. Now, tying into that higher capacity point, at a certain point, once you start running buses super frequently, as you would have to on some of those Toronto streetcar lines if you were to replace them with buses, you run into bunching. And that's when the light cycles are often shorter than the frequencies you're running, which in some cases you'd need to, because say you're running at a 5-minute streetcar frequency and you have to do 3 buses for every streetcar, well then you're getting into a 1.5 minute frequency. That's going to lead to major bunching, and bunching basically degrades that frequency down and makes the whole capacity of the line be significantly reduced, and of course service quality, which means that at some point when you're in these kind of mixed operations, going to lower and lower frequencies is just really difficult. And again, Toronto is a great reference point here because Toronto has many of the most used bus lines in North America. I'm going to mention another one of the most used in a few minutes. But again, comparing those to streetcar routes, on shorter routes, streetcars often outcompete those same bus routes, and so you can see the capacity is just higher and the service reliability is still quite strong. Now, a small point I want to mention is psychological permanence. It's a real effect, and it's the fact that people see hard infrastructure like streetcar rails, something that is necessitated by streetcars, and compared to regular bus routes, not BRT but regular bus routes, it has a sense for people that this isn't going to be something that's taken away from me in a couple years, right? When I build development next to a streetcar route, it's likely to stay for at least a decent amount of time. And given the way the world is going, I don't think we're going to have another phase where we rip out all the streetcar lines like we did back in the mid-20th century. And so I think that this permanence point is a real win for streetcars. Another thing is the better ride quality, and this is something I'm surprised more people don't realize is a thing. As someone who's personally taken a lot of bus commutes in my life, even on relatively straight corridors, the weaving in and out of traffic to get to stops and the really hard turns that often are necessitated on buses are just really uncomfortable, especially as a standing passenger, as well as bus suspension often being quite rough and hard, especially on a lot of newer bus models. In comparison, I can often ride streetcar routes without even holding on. Not that I'd recommend that, but it just goes to show that streetcars are typically a smoother ride experience, and that's good for a number of reasons. It also can be attributed to those longer lifespans of streetcar vehicles because generally they are facing kind of gentler treatment when they're out on the roads. Now, I want to mention something, maybe the elephant in the room if you're a Canadian viewer, the 99B line bus in Vancouver. Of course, you might say buses like the 99B line can carry massive numbers of passengers. In fact, the 99B line route in Vancouver is the most used bus route in Canada or the United States, carrying over 55,000 riders per day. Now, if you're curious what the most used one in North America is, I believe several of the routes in CDMX in Mexico are more used. These are heavy BRT routes, and so those are the most used in North America. The reality about the 99B line is this though. It's still a bus route, and that's a limitation. You see, the 99B line is basically packed to the gills at rush hour. Buses are coming every 3 minutes, and that pretty much gets you to the peak of what you can offer with a bus service. In fact, you typically can't get much higher in terms of service frequency unless you go to full metro with full automatic train control, etc. So once you get to those type of headways, the only option you really have is to increase the per vehicle capacity by going from articulated buses to something like a large Flexity streetcar, which has around twice the capacity of such a vehicle. I should also point out that the 99B line is not some miraculous unicorn. I hate to be that Toronto-centric person, and again, I'm from Vancouver, but a number of the suburban bus routes in Toronto carry almost as many riders as the 99B line, and they do so without necessarily using exclusively articulated buses and without nearly as much prioritization on the roadway. it just goes to show that bus routes, when the service and land use is often conducive to ridership, buses can be successful in pretty much any context. Now, compared to the 99B line, the 504 King, which has slightly more prioritization and does operate through the downtown core of Toronto, carries over 80,000 riders per day. So that's over 30,000 more than the 99B line. Now, again, it does go through a dense area, but I'm really talking more about maximum capacity. As we know, the 99B line is being replaced with a full metro service, but if we're talking about covering a ton of the dense urban cores of cities with rapid frequent transit, it's just not practical to do it entirely with metro services. And if buses can only offer around 50,000 plus people per direction per hour, then capacity is basically going to be hard limited at that level. Now, there is the argument that you could just implement BRT, but the reality is that on a relatively narrow urban corridor, the type of BRT you're implementing just isn't going to increase capacity that much. BRT with high capacity often requires kind of a fully dedicated right-of-way and multiple lanes so you can have passing, etc., something which streetcar lines don't require you to have because the vehicles, again, themselves are larger. In addition, streetcars, like the ones used in Toronto, can have more doors, which enables a shorter dwell time, which again helps with keeping frequencies higher, rather than buses, which have roughly half as many doors as a streetcar. The point I want to make about where I think streetcars make the most sense is the dense urban corridors. To be perfectly clear, I think if you were to take the 99B line and say that route had streetcar tracks on it miraculously overnight, I still think that streetcars could provide a better service than the current 99B line bus because the vehicles are simply larger and operating at a reasonable local transit frequency, something which happens again with the Toronto streetcar system, but which doesn't happen with the new US streetcar systems. You can get easily up to the capacities you would need to carry far more people than something like the 99B line. However, I don't, again, think that's the place to put streetcar routes because a long corridor like Broadway does make sense with rapid transit because the distances between stations can be covered much more quickly if you have just a few stops and you have a fully grade separated right-of-way. Where I think streetcars make the most sense is, as with King Street in Toronto, in dense urban corridors. Think areas like the downtown core of Vancouver along the waterfront areas, False Creek, the Arbutus Greenway, so places that already have right-of-ways and places that are really dense. The reality is that, as I mentioned before, in North America in general, urban boulevards are very wide. Often they have space for car parking on the sides, and so implementing streetcar routes down the center of wider streets, I'm talking 6 lanes at least, means that you could easily have a dedicated right-of-way for the streetcars down the center, and then on 4-lane roads you could implement more of the King Street approach, where you have primarily transit dedicated lanes in the center and some limited local traffic for automobiles. In addition, some of these cities also have already put space aside for future streetcars, Vancouver being a good example, where there's a number of medians that have been built that are basically planned for future streetcar use, and in places like that, it's really easy to have that dedicated median streetcar operation. Now, the main reason I think that these streetcar networks make a ton of sense in the dense urban nodes, think the downtown peninsula of Vancouver, or the core areas of Seattle, or downtown Toronto, is that they offer something which neither buses nor metros can offer currently. When compared to buses, you have a higher maximum capacity without having to absolutely blast the streets full of buses every couple minutes, which again rapidly degrades because of that high frequency. So you have a higher capacity than buses, and you have a cheaper cost to build than metros, a much cheaper cost. Often, I would say building a single high capacity subway line would probably cost about as much as implementing a grid of streetcar routes. Now, I think we need both of those things, but streetcar routes can cover a lot more ground than a single high capacity line and can operate really well for that last mile, getting people from the station to their place of work, etc., along with things like bikes and walking. So, to close, essentially what I'm saying is that streetcars don't need to replace all buses, but there's places where streetcars make more sense than buses, and the argument that streetcars are stupid, or streetcars block traffic, or streetcars are just, development tools, or it's like the monorail from The Simpsons. It misses the point that streetcars and trams, etc., can offer something which buses can't. It can offer a higher quality of transit as well as higher capacity in a way that bridges the gap between traditional bus service and full rapid transit. Streetcars aren't LRT, and I think increasingly I'm starting to believe that streetcars make more sense than LRT, because at least with a streetcar you have a much lower cost to build, whereas with LRT you often have such high costs because of doing things like big grade separations and dedicated right-of-way and stuff that you might as well just build a fully automated metro system like Copenhagen or Vancouver have done. So I think streetcars fill a nice niche where it's higher capacity than buses, lower cost than full rapid transit, and where I think streetcars do better than buses. Thanks for watching the video, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.